Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast at Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. This is Season 6, Episode 5, and we are talking about Unit 731 in the Japanese-occupied China. With me today are Jackson.
Hello.
Nick.
Hello.
And Noah.
Hello.
And today, the guys are going to be getting into, like I said, Unit 731. This is it's a pretty deep topic. This is some pretty serious stuff. If you don't know much about this, Unit 731 was an experimental unit in the Japanese occupied force of China, and they experimented on POWs and civilians in a number of ways that I'm sure the guys we'll talk about. But it's really kind of, I think, one of the worst parts of the war that you can really get into, and it shows you that racial ideology and then how twisted it makes everything else become. I'm going to turn it over to them, and we'll get a little intro from Jackson.
In an era of rising totalitarian regimes, Imperial Japan began to bestow its power. Built from years of ideological rewiring, Japan would demonstrate its strength upon the world. Dating back to January 3rd, 1868, Japan would refurbish their government and create new identities culturally. This event would be known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is most notably known for its modernization of the Japanese government and its culture, where it abolished the samurai class, ended the Tokugawa shogunate, formed a parliament, and introduced modern weapons. Ultimately, the Meiji Restoration made way for a modern Japanese society through separation from Western society, isolationism, and a more centralized government. As a result, Japanese society would adopt beliefs of superiority, especially over Chinese individuals who believed to be poisoned by Western culture due to British occupation. Over many years and years of Japan's propaganda and indoctrination of supremacy, the people of Japan, who have already had past negative viewpoints upon the Chinese, were growing even stronger animosity towards the Chinese people. Japan's empire was not home to many resources, while China was available to many resources. The strong hatred and supremacy of the Japanese towards China would eventually lead to Japan's invasion of Manchuria, where eventual test sites of biological warfare would be made. Unit 731 was the name given to a secret chemical and biological weapons program that was won by the Japanese Army in China from 1936 to 1945. Unit 731 was infamous for its extreme methods and excessive cruelty. Its doctors experiment on human subjects, often in horrific and sadistic ways. They perform surgery on victims without anesthesia, remove limbs, expose people to extreme temperatures, and purposely infected subjects with deadly diseases. Several thousand people are estimated to have died as a direct result of the unit's experiments. Many tens of thousands and more are believed to be killed in field experiments on local populations. Upon Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, 1935 and to 1945, many of the unit's doctors were granted immunity from these war crimes by the United States during the Tokyo trials in exchange for the scientific data they collected.
All right, a little background and overview. Following the events of World War I, the world would come together to agree on the events of war. The League of Nations would form with founding members including the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Japan, and many more. Since the events of World War I, or previously named the Great War, the League of Nations would create a protocol banning events and attacks that have occurred during World War I that they believed were not right. This led to the signing of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which banned the use of both biological and chemical weapons. The Geneva Protocol would pass in the League of Nations, and this included Japan, which is a member at Geneva Protocol. But Japan would never ratify it until 1970, and this would allow Imperial Japan, a country never agreeing with the protocol to begin with, to facilitate and start Unit 731. Since Imperial Japan would ultimately end up ignoring it, they would look towards goals of maximizing its abilities of fighting with the use of biological weapons. Because they believed in the supremacy of the race, they did not begin experiments with biological warfare. And biological warfare is the weaponization of diseases and infection militarily. Yet once Imperial Japan invaded China, research of biological and chemical warfare was viewed as possible. This was because they would begin using the people of China as test subjects in research. This was made possible by General Shiro Ishii, who became interested in experimenting with chemical and biological weapons after they were banned at the Geneva Protocol. As a medical student, he was fascinated with the idea of a cheap invisible weapon that could cause easy and large amounts of harm. The reason that it was accepted was due to Japan's desire for expansion and resources, along with their racist ideology towards all Western influence and propaganda that the United States was producing chemical and biological weapons. And Shiro Ishii also had great political connections and influence, which allowed him to gain favor from military officials. Their views of supremacy for the people and government of Japan to view anyone who opposed them as less than human or not human.
The Japanese first began their biological and chemical weapons program in what was known as the Togo Unit. Under the command of Shiro Ishii, the name Togo Unit was a code name from him after Admiral Togo Heihachiro of the Japanese Navy. The Togo Unit was the start of the research on biological and chemical weapons from the Japanese. The program began in 1932, where it was run in a village named Beiyenhe, a village near Harbin in Manchukuo, China. The building of the Togo Unit was known as the Zongma Fortress. At the Zongma Fortress, prisoners were collected via Chinese inhabitants. Initially, research began with healthy prisoners. The good health of the prisoners was made possible by the feeding and taking care of the subjects, in which experiments began, like elongated bleeding, dehydration, and starvation to see how long humans could survive. Diseases and infections were explored, in which, when a prisoner was diseased, they would then be vivisected, so that the researchers could examine the infection in the human body. During the experimentation of the Togo Unit at the Zongma Fortress, which was not involved with the Japanese military, so soldiers did not run the buildings. This led to major events happening at the Zongma Fortress, such as a prison break in 1934, an explosion, and burning of the fortress in 1935. In 1936, Shiro Ishii was placed in charge of a new and much larger program in a facility based in Pingfing district outside Harbin, which was the largest city in Manchuria, China. This program was heavily aided under the Japanese government, where the program's funding was increased and now under the Japanese military. With the program being under the Japanese military, it allowed for soldiers to guard the building and prisoners no longer allowing incidents like before. The program that these experiments operated under was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Unit Department. This was the alias used to mask the program from the public. It wasn't officially named Unit 731 until 1941. Just as the name was fake, the building held a fake welcome center to hide the underground shipping of prisoners from the public. The program had a large staff consisting of several thousand workers and was housed in a massive facility consisting of 150 buildings. These buildings were fully furnished with laboratories for experiments, operating rooms, military barracks for soldiers, and multiple crematoriums. By this point, Unit 731 would hold over 10,000 people. Prisoners of the facility were mainly inhabitants of China, but were also Soviets, Koreans, Mongolians, and political Japanese enemies. Upon arrival, prisoners were given what was called vaccines, which were actually diseases the researchers were studying. Unit 731's research did not only involve human research, as it involved the treatment and manifestation of disease, infection, and harm.
So I'm going to go into talking about how Unit 731 was set up. So Unit 731's facilities were separated into 8 different divisions. The first division was responsible for all bacteriological research, like studying the bubonic plague, typhoid, anthrax, dysentery, glanders, and cholera. It also included pathology, which is studying organ tissues changes due to injuries, and physiology, which is the body's response to stimuli. And that could be relating to cold, dehydration, and blood loss. So here are some of the diseases that they were studying with. Cholera. It was given to prisons from food and water, and it caused rapid dehydration and electrolyte loss, which would lead to stuff like diarrhea and vomiting. The plague. Prisoners would be infected with fleas that were released on Chinese cities, and it would cause swollen lymph nodes, chills, and fevers. typhoid. Prisoners were infected for experimentation, and it caused abdominal pain, prolonged fever, and rashes. They used anthrax, which prisoners were infected with anthrax for military experimentation to be used, and it caused severe respiratory illness and death when you inhaled it. Prisoners were infected with dysentery, and it caused cramps, bloody diarrhea, and fever. Prisoners were infected with glanders for experimentation by the military, and it had a prolonged effect on horses and caused pneumonia, skin lesions, and infections.
I think what's important to keep in mind as you kind of went through that is this unit is taking these diseases that even in Nazi Germany, right, they're very aware of typhus. They're very aware of how these things can spread through their camps, and they're cautious about it, right? They execute people, remove people from it, but they're infecting people with it intentionally, right? They're using contaminated water to do a whole bunch of things. And so it's a whole setup. So no, it's a very good point.
The 2nd Division was responsible for researching ways to utilize this biological warfare and study it in the field to learn how it spread diseases on a battlefield. It worked closely with the 1st Division for the design of chemical and biodispersal systems and gathered the data about the pathogens after deployment. The 3rd Division was responsible for the industry and production of the biological agents. The 4th Division was labeled as a public health unit that researched water for purification, waterborne diseases, and epidemic prevention, but it actually used Public Health Initiative as a cover to support biological warfare operations. The 5th Division was responsible for managing personnel, records, logistics, and finances. It had a roster of scientists, soldiers, and other staff that coordinated procurement of supplies and equipment, handled communications with the Kuomintang Army and Tokyo, and secured transports of prisoners and managing security protocols. The 6th Division was responsible for the management and guarding of detainees used in the experiment. They were housing, transportation, and controlling prisoners and supplying victims to research groups on demand, along with the destroying of evidence and corpses of these victims. The 7th Division was responsible for the training of medical officers and scientists for the Japanese Army. They provided instruction in bacteriology under the guide of epidemic prevention, preparing officers for deployment to other special units, and conducting lectures and demonstrations. The 8th Division was responsible for miscellaneous logistics, veterinary, and support units. The veterinary section, it conducted animal experiments and managed livestock. The transport division managed all the vehicles, fuel, and field test logistics. The engineering division maintained buildings, power, water supply, and infrastructure. And the supply division stored all the equipment, food, medical supplies, and uniforms necessary. So to recap this, the 1st Division performed the experiments on biological agents. Division 2 tested military deployment. Division 3 produced materials. Division 4 maintained sanitation. The 5th Division held records of prisoners. 6th Division supplied subjects. 7th Division studied a broader thing of military and other officials. And the 8th Division handled supports. And this kind of just shows how each of the divisions were able to work so tightly together and use the information from the separate divisions to benefit one another. And also, this also aided in the cover-up of this unit, as they were able to kind of cover each section with a different benefit.
Yeah, and I think what's important too is to understand that this isn't something that's a random event, right? This is highly planned out. This is well put together. It's got an infrastructure, as you just outlined. So, I mean, this is something that a lot of people had their hands in, most of which didn't get in trouble after, as you guys talked about already.
So Unit 731 is infamous for its human experimentation during World War II. The prisoners and test subjects were known as Murata or Muratas. Murata meaning log in Japanese, and they were labeled as that because of their belief of dehumanizing and racism. They used log because it's like a physical object, and that's how they viewed them, as a tool to better themselves. It showed how they saw them less as human. People who operated in Unit 731 would say things like, how many logs did they cut down today? And this was directly caused by their racial supremacy in Japan and that they were indoctrinated into. Research in Unit 731 would be published in which the human test subjects that were experimented on were claimed to be primates or Manchurian monkeys. Dr. Harris Sheldon estimates that at least 10 to 12,000 prisoners died in biological experiments. No one who entered the facility would return alive, and prisoners who were transported into the facility were bagged and put in blacked out vehicles so they could never share where the facility was. They would then be transported through underground tunnels, and all the prisoners would be murdered with no survivors. A little anecdote: Yoshimura Hisato is a physiologist that operated Unit 731, and he had a special interest in hypothermia, and he used human subjects to test their reaction to frostbite. Hisato routinely submerged the prisoners' victims in a tub of water filled with ice and held them there until the limbs were frozen solid and a coat of ice formed over their skin. He then timed the victims to check how long it took for human bodies to develop frostbites. According to a witness, the limbs were sounding like a plank of wood when struck or touched. And then he tried different methods to rapidly thaw out the frozen appendage, such as dousing them in hot water and open fire, or leaving them untreated overnight to see how long it would take the prisoner to thaw out from the heat of their blood. Unit 731 was able to scientifically prove that the best treatment for frostbite was to immerse it in water a bit warmer than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but never more than 122. They also commonly practice vivisections, which is the practice of performing operations on living beings for the purpose of experimentation. When they performed these vivisections, they often did it without anesthesia and to study the operation of their systems while they were awake. It was performed on thousands, mostly Chinese prisoners, as well as children or elderly farmers. They were infected with diseases such as cholera or the bubonic plague, and then they had their limbs removed for examination before they died in order to study the effects without the decomposition and death affecting how the results would be. They were also subject to injuries such as burns, frostbite, or wounds from shrapnel of explosions, and the purpose was to examine the internal damage and compare the effectiveness of different weapons. And vivisections are actually considered a war crime because they were forced into the operation against their will, and it's almost always lethal. And it violates the Geneva Convention, which states that they cannot cause unnecessary civilian suffering, and also they're doing it for the purpose of biological agents, which are also banned by the Geneva Convention. Subjects of the study were also exposed to gangrene and had their limbs amputated and reattached to the other side of the body, while others had their limbs crushed or frozen or had their circulation cut off. And after they used them up and they were exhausted, they were normally just killed afterward. And some of the subjects were cut into and stripped on their stomach, to which their intestines would be connected to their esophagus.
Some things I would like to say is that with the amputation of limbs, they would constantly cut off both arms and then either attach it to the subject's back or put the left arm where the right shoulder is, or put them backwards, and just to quote unquote see if the body could reattach itself, which makes you question what was the use of some of this research. Other atrocities included was Unit 731 studied experiments involving weapons and the lethality of weapons. This included bayonets, swords, and knives with the use of their prisoners. Research was conducted upon the explosion of hand grenades on groups of prisoners to see how much damage it caused and how much distance it covered. Research was conducted upon firearms by lining up prisoners and firing rounds to see how many prisoners the ammunition had penetrated through. They also studied flamethrowers on both covered and exposed skin. They set up gas chambers to test subjects with blister agents and nerve gas. They studied prolonged X-rays, which sterilized and killed thousands of testing subjects. The Imperial Japanese Army was interested in the symptoms and treatment of syphilis. Male prisoners infected with syphilis were ordered to rape female and male prisoners were to monitor the onset of the disease. More rape was arranged until the exposure established infection. Researchers wanted a better understanding of the disease due to the increase of syphilis among the Japanese army. This was due to the use of systemic raping of civilian women and sex slaves. They sought to increase their understanding of the disease and better treatment options. The methods they used to infect people with syphilis were through forced sexual intercourse from someone who was intentionally infected by injection or with someone who already had it. They did this to observe how the infection spread and progressed only on newly infected people. They would then record the stages of the disease by monitoring the infected and doing live vivisections to see the effects of the disease on their organs without changes from death. They also purposefully infected pregnant women specifically with syphilis due to their interest in the transfer of syphilis from mother to fetus. They would then do a vivisection a few months into their pregnancy to remove and observe the effects of a mother carrying syphilis on the fetus. Other STDs were tested and displayed under the same experiments. There were human subjects locked up and deprived of food and water to learn how long humans could survive. In order to study crash injuries, heavy subjects were dropped onto bounded prisoners. The effects of high G-force on pilots and falling paratroopers were studied by loading human beings into large centrifuges and spun them at a high and higher speeds until they lost consciousness or died, which usually happened between 10 to 15 Gs.
So there's some more atrocities about Unit 731. Going into that, female prisoners of childbearing age were forcibly impregnated so that weapon and trauma experiments could be done on them. Pregnant test subjects were infected with varied diseases, exposed to chemical weapons, crash injuries, bullet wounds, and shrapnel injuries. And then they were opened up and they were studying to see the effect that it had on the fetuses. Disease trials were also conducted of the bubonic plague, which included at least 12 field tests of the bubonic plague. Of the 12 field tests, 11 were studied in Chinese cities, where researchers studied the use of fleas infected with the bubonic plague, killing people in those cities. Also, the Japanese government aimed to unleash a biologically engineered weapon of the bubonic plague upon San Francisco, and which was called Operation Cherry Blossoms at night on September 22nd, 1945. We'll get into more of that later. One worker named Sudo had contracted the bubonic plague from the prisoners, and because of this, he was vivisected to study the infections of the disease. Even though he worked and was Japanese, he was looked at as nothing more than research. Some researchers at Unit 731 just simply let their curiosity take over, in which they claimed to have been studying the implications of decapitating somebody. An individual who testified from what happened at Unit 731 would later speak about how the researchers studying the decapitations had nothing to study to begin with, as they were just murdering these prisoners. The individual at Unit 731 spoke out and said that those researchers would go on to become professors at university and other big-time scientists. Nakagawa Yanso, Kyoto University, said, "Some of these experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or of medicine. There is no such thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purposes were served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. This was just playing around. Professional people, too. They like to play."
More atrocities where prisoners were also hung upside down to see how long it would take for them to die from the blood flow going to their head and built up blood pressure in their head. Prisoners were sweated to death in total dehydration experiments where the prisoners were placed in rooms with many hot and dry fans. When dead, the prisoners were said to only weigh a fifth of their original body weight. The average lifespan of a prisoner or test subject at Unit 731 was approximately 2 months. Majority of prisoners and test subjects died within a few weeks, yet the average lifespan is raised as some women were held alive for pregnancy testing. Prisoners and test subjects were put into gas chambers involving mustard gas, some unclothed and some with equipment for the gas. It is said that 30 to 40,000 prisoners went in, none survived. 200,000 to 300,000 people died as a result of Japanese biological warfare.
And very good job, guys, kind of really running through that. And I want to take a slight break because that's a pretty heavy duty thing to research. As you guys were doing the research, what are you thinking as you kind of get deeper and deeper into this? Yeah, Jackson.
You know, like searching some of these like documents and like testimonies like from workers, like it shows you like how graphic they were conducting these experiments, but also the duality of it is that you see that how many scientific advances were made from these experiments, like regardless of how terrible they were. But it's just so insane, like when you're looking at these and you see like what they're doing to these people, especially like women and children, pregnant women, and what they're utilizing to do to these people, like syphilis and the bubonic plague, or like all these terrible things. You can only like just simply just put yourself in their shoes and imagine what they were going through in the last moments of their life. They're in a unit with a bunch of Japanese soldiers and scientists, and they're being murdered for science.
Nick?
I just wanted to say that Unit 731 is like over a decade long, and from around 1939 to the end of its lifespan, it was frequent killings, like it was rampant, and these researchers just believed that the prisoners were like cattle and nothing more other than research. And to that, it's really just insane to think about the indoctrination of racial supremacy that the Japanese Empire had, that these highly intellectual individuals and researchers saw other people as nothing more than data on a sheet.
Noah?
As I started researching Unit 731, it baffled me about how little I knew. Like, normally you're taught all these things about World War II, and it seems like you have a good understanding of it. But when you look like in between the lines, you can just see how awful it was. I had no clue that Unit 731 was as bad as it was, that there were literally no survivors. And it was really difficult to find any anecdotes or personal narratives because of how well it was covered up. And it's just insane that this goes under the radar and people aren't as well informed as they really should be.
So as you guys researched, you used a variety of sources, so props to that. What source stood out to you as the one where it was kind of like eye-popping one, Nick?
Before our research, we went to the World War II Museum, and they showed us two very notable books that most of our research came from. One was called Unit 731, Japan's Secret Biological Warfare in World War II, and then the other was Unit 731, The Forgotten Asian Auschwitz. And these two books, they showed they actually gave a good bit of anecdotes and personal narratives, and there's, like Noah said earlier, there's like basically none, because the only narratives that come out of Unit 731 are some people speaking 40 years later or some researchers speaking at the Tokyo trials, and there's not much. And then we also used a website called Pacific Atrocities Education, and this website had like so much on it. They had videos of the people researching it, and I found this as the most like helpful site that we used in source, and they were super blunt, and I think it was good because it brings awareness to all these atrocities that are basically just covered up and not taught.
So that brings up a good question though. Why do you guys think that, and you've hinted at it, that after the war this is kind of covered up? What makes you think?
I believe that mostly it was covered up because of how beneficial this evidence was. And later on in our podcast, we're going to talk about like what benefits came from this. And like I said before, like despite like all the atrocities, like it would seem so appealing to either a government or a branch of science that how this information could be used to benefit not only society, but further research and experimentation. And this just goes to show the dark history of intelligence testing and how they utilize these harmful techniques to get this. But it also shows you how everyone was participating in this in the end, especially if you took in this valuable information.
Nick?
I would also like to say that for the U.S. to come in and help cover up and take this research, there was obviously incentives of that they didn't know what all the research held, but they were incentivized by that. But I think the main reason the cover-up was made is because of the scarcity or the scarce of communism, and the Soviet Union would also come into play with Unit 731, and this led to, as we'll talk about later, the researchers at Unit 731 making sure they compromise with the U.S. because the Soviet Union is known to kill if they don't agree with. So
let's jump to that. Let's go to the aftermath and the cover up. That's a really interesting part.
All right. I'll start off the cover up. So, following the atomic bomb, General Douglas MacArthur, along with the United States officials, traveled to Japan. MacArthur told the officials of Unit 731 that if the evidence of the experiments conducted at the facility did not comply with U.S. standards, then the Soviet Union would trial the Japanese for Unit 731. After originally only speaking of some of the experiments, the Japanese would comply with the U.S. and be tried. U.S. officials wanted to keep the data received hidden because they saw the potential in the biological warfare data that Ishii and his scientists created, and more importantly, feared that if the Soviets had gotten this information, then they would make great advancements in biological and chemical warfare. Once the Tokyo War trials became public, it appears that a break from interrogations was needed to form plans on how to proceed on this biological warfare matter. Measures were taken to restrict any access to the suspects, and by the end of 1946, the legal section was at a good pace for collecting new data. It took a few months for a response of General Douglas MacArthur's request regarding the immunity for the officers. The task force involved in the trials strongly urged that with written immunity should be given in order to ensure that the Japanese would continue to give them information on the matter. It was also assured by the IPS that they could not intervene in the immunity project because it had already been assured in December and again in June in 47 that no action should be taken to bring the accusations of the biological warfare into the Tokyo war crimes trials due to the lack of evidence that could have supported the witnesses' statements. After years and years of Japanese cover-up that was caused by the United States, historians and ex-workers of Unit 731 began unveiling its secrets. Originally, the Japanese government denied these events until around 1970s, 1980s, when historians in Japan began to include Unit 731 in their textbooks. The Japanese government tried censoring it, but they were faced with the released records of Unit 731 from MacArthur's investigation upon Unit 731. In recent years, Unit 731 has now been revealed, and the deaths caused by it being counted into the toll in World War II.
Yeah, so, I think to piggyback off what Jackson was just talking about, like you and Nick, I think, mentioned this too. You got to put it in the context of the Cold War, right? After the war's over, China moves toward communism. And so at that point, there's not nearly as much of a pressing desire to even really go deeper into this by the time we get to 19. And Japan, we're going to have a military base there, right? We work very closely with them. So there's a very weird political situation. And as you guys kind of said, the United States takes some of the medical discoveries and uses them very similarly to the medical experiments in the Holocaust. There are certain things that are going to be used. Does it justify the killing of thousands of people? No, right? But they are going to kind of use those. We are running out of time. So I wanted to give you guys some final thoughts about this topic, anything you wanted to bring up.
So earlier in the podcast, I mentioned how there was advances made by this Unit 731. So I'm going to go through a few of them. The world gained a better understanding of bacteriological agents and biological warfare. We received data on the human body under extreme conditions and how to treat frostbite, dehydration, starvation limits, and the effect of untreated syphilis. More information was received on how diseases spread between humans. The relationship between particle size and infection rate was discovered. We also discovered that water percentage of the human body was 70%. We discovered how many G's it takes to kill a pilot or a paratrooper. So overall, while the events that took place at Unit 731 are like completely inexcusable, the experiments done at the facility made it more appealing to the United States to aid the cover-up, and it led to multiple scientific and technological breakthroughs that are still today. And knowing this, it brings more depth to the topic of Unit 731 and makes it more emotional to think about the victims.
All right, Nick.
I would like to wrap up a couple of things that we mentioned earlier, like Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. One method developed was when they would disperse massive amounts of cargo filled with infected fleas that would spread among detonations. The Japanese planned to use this agent against the United States by attaching them to balloons and setting them off along the Pacific Ocean or dropping them inside bombs on top of U.S. cities. And I would also like to mention about once Japan surrendered in August of 1945, in Unit 731, it was more like a panic. So under Shiro Ishii, he ordered the killing of all remaining prisoners, and they attempted to remove and discard all records and documents with even flamethrowers. And another thing is from the cover-up and the immunity, someone like Shiro Ishii, who was behind the atrocities of Unit 731, he was never really given what he should have deserved, and he's not talked about enough about his evil actions and what he orchestrated, and he would eventually die of laryngeal cancer in 1959.
Another thing about the cover-up, while I do agree that they did it for the purpose of their own scientific advancement and to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining an advantage from the information, I also believe that had a moral obligation to help cover up Japan due to nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because if they were to go through and prosecute all these high-ranking military and government officials, it would collapse Japan and cripple them really hard, and it would be really hard for them to build back up.
And that was brought up at the Tokyo trials when they put Tojo on trial and a number of other Japanese commanders, where they're like, you're criticizing us, you firebombed our entire country and then dropped 2 nuclear weapons, right? And so there is something kind of to that. So, Nick.
I would also like to mention a first-hand account. One instance between prisoners and a worker was recorded when technician Naokata Ishibashi broke the rule of no social interaction between workers and prisoners. Ishibashi speaks about when 2 prisoners, a 21-year-old Chinese woman and a 19-year-old Soviet woman from Ukraine, had asked him for a mirror so that they can see what they look like. Ishibashi said, "I gave them that mirror, but I couldn't save them. They died horribly, like so many others. I still remember their voices." The woman would later die from being vivisected. Ishibashi is an example of a worker at Unit 731, where it is believed that the workers here were able to do their atrocities because they saw anyone other than Japanese as inferior. Yet Ishibashi makes human connection with prisoners and displays remorse.
Jax.
So while we've been on the topic of workers and the cover-up and after the war, I'd like to mention that majority of these workers that assisted in Unit 731, and that being either like military officers or like just general scientists that assisted in the experiments, most of them just returned home after Unit 731 was like shut down, the war was over. They just returned home, and majority of them either became high-ranking military officials or they were very prestigious doctors and medical professionals. And like Nick mentioned, Shiro Ishii was the mastermind behind all this. He's responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. He was never even trialed for his crimes. He only died later because he had cancer in 1959.
Yeah, I think it is one of those things. There's a lot of factors that go into that. One, there's trial fatigue after the Nuremberg trials, and there's a lot of people wanting to just move on. And then there's the idea, if this happened in Europe, I think there's more trials, right? But it happened in China, it happened in Asia, and so our own prejudice in the United States probably played a little role to that. Well, guys, this is a very deep topic. Thank you so much. You did a great job, and this was Tigers by the Fire. Thank you for listening.